When people talk about Franklin Delano Roosevelt, they picture the strong leader who guided America through the Great Depression and World War II. But behind the speeches, the fireside chats, and the political battles, there was a huge family living in his shadow. A family that would grow into 23 grandchildren, each with their own dreams, struggles, and complicated relationship with the Roosevelt legacy. Most Americans know almost nothing about them. Some stayed close to the family's political roots. Others ran from it, wanting normal lives. A few became successful in business, writing, or public service. And some simply disappeared from the public eye, choosing privacy after a lifetime of expectations. But why were they forgotten? Part of the reason is that FDR's own fame was enormous. His personality filled every room, every moment, every memory. His children and grandchildren often said it felt impossible to live up to the Roosevelt name. Many of them were born into a world where strangers expected greatness from them before they even learned to walk. Some tried to follow the political path and discovered the world had changed. Others rejected politics completely, building quiet careers far from Washington. Some struggled with broken marriages, financial problems, or emotional pressure. Some embraced the spotlight only to regret it later. And a few became surprising success stories that almost no one knows today. This story is not about the president. It is about the legacy he left behind. A legacy carried not in history books, but in the lives of 23 people who inherited a famous last name and all the weight that came with it. This is the hidden journey of FDR's grandchildren, where they went, what they became, and why the world forgot them. Growing up as a grandchild of Franklin Delano Roosevelt meant living under an enormous shadow. For many of the 23 grandchildren, the Roosevelt name felt less like a gift and more like a constant reminder of expectations they didn't choose. They entered a world where strangers already believed they knew who they should become: leaders, diplomats, activists, or at least something remarkable. But the truth was more complicated. As children, some of them visited the famous Roosevelt homes at Hyde Park and Campobello. These places weren't just family properties. They were national monuments, filled with tourists, historians, and reporters. There was no such thing as a simple family gathering. Everything felt historic, even when they were just playing games on the lawn. Their parents, FDR's sons and daughter, also carried heavy pressure. Many of them struggled with careers, marriages, and alcohol problems, and those struggles naturally passed down. In fact, several of the grandchildren later admitted that being a Roosevelt sometimes felt like being part of a dynasty no one was prepared to manage. School wasn't easier. Teachers expected brilliance. Classmates treated them as curiosities. The Roosevelt name opened doors, but it also created anxiety. Many tried to hide who they were. Others leaned into the legacy, hoping to turn the attention into opportunity, but almost all of them felt the weight. Behind the reporters, the public fascination, and the historic photographs were 23 children trying to find a sense of normal. But normal isn't easy when your grandfather was one of the most powerful men in American history. And as they grew older, they would discover that the Roosevelt legacy wasn't just a story. It was a shadow that followed them for life. Not every Roosevelt grandchild wanted a political life, but a few felt drawn to it, almost as if the family name carried its own gravity. Some believed public service was in their DNA. Others felt pressured to continue the Roosevelt tradition, even if politics wasn't their natural path. The most visible attempt came from Franklin Delano Roosevelt Jr.'s children. His son, Franklin Delano Roosevelt III, became a respected economist and professor, often speaking about inequality, a topic that echoed his grandfather's values. Another, Christopher DuPont Roosevelt, stayed close to political circles, working in government-related roles and serving on public boards. Then there was James Roosevelt Jr., a grandson who embraced public service more directly, He became a lawyer, served in the Clinton administration, and spent years navigating healthcare and Medicare issues, carrying the Roosevelt name into modern policy debates. But politics had changed drastically since FDR's time. The Roosevelt grandchildren didn't have the same era-defining moment. No Great Depression, no World War, no fireside chats to unite the country. Their attempts often felt smaller, not because they lacked talent, but because the world no longer revolved around a single leader. Some grandchildren ran for office, but faced tough campaigns. Voters admired the name, but expected more than a legacy. They wanted fresh ideas, not nostalgia. As a result, many Roosevelt heirs who tried politics discovered that the family name was not a guarantee. It was a burden. The higher the pedestal, the harder the fall. Still, these political heirs carried their grandfather's spirit. They fought for social programs, civil rights, and public welfare. And although none reached FDR-level fame, they kept the flame alive in their own quiet, determined way. While a few Roosevelt grandchildren pursued public life, most wanted nothing to do with fame or politics. They wanted the one thing their last name rarely allowed: privacy. Some became teachers, doctors, engineers, or small business owners. Their resumes never mentioned the Roosevelt connection. They introduced themselves simply, not as the descendants of a four-term president, but as ordinary people with ordinary jobs. One grandchild became a librarian, saying it was the only place she felt truly at peace. Another moved out west, raising horses far from the noise of Washington. Others built careers in accounting, nonprofit work, or community organizing. They found purpose not in the spotlight, but in everyday life. Their decisions were often shaped by childhood experiences. Many remembered reporters showing up at their homes, asking questions no child should answer. Others recalled adults comparing them to their grandfather, asking whether they would change the world someday. These constant reminders pushed many of them away from ambition and toward simplicity. The quiet ones also carried the family scars silently. Some dealt with the Roosevelt pattern of broken marriages. Others struggled with money, despite public assumptions that the Roosevelts were endlessly wealthy. A few battled emotional pressure their entire lives, trying to find an identity separate from their famous lineage. But these quieter grandchildren also held the family together in ways the public never saw. They attended reunions, preserved old letters, protected family stories, and raised their own children with a gentler understanding of legacy. Their lives may not have made headlines, but they preserved something important: the humanity behind the Roosevelt name. In the silence they chose, they found the freedom their grandfather never had. If anyone understood the weight of the Roosevelt story, it was the grandchildren who became writers and historians. They grew up surrounded by archives, letters, speeches, and memories. For them, the past was alive, not as a history chapter, but as family conversation. Some of the most influential was Curtis Roosevelt, the grandson who spent part of his childhood in the White House. Known to the public as Buzzy, he later became an author and historian, writing about what it was really like growing up as America's first grandchild. His books revealed the emotional challenges of being raised under constant public attention, offering rare insight into the human side of the Roosevelt dynasty. Another grandchild, Eleanor Sis Seagraves, dedicated her life to keeping the story of Eleanor Roosevelt alive. She worked with archives, curated photographs, and protected documents that historians still use today. She didn't seek fame. She sought accuracy, wanting the world to remember her grandmother not as a distant figure, but as a woman of enormous compassion and resilience. Others wrote memoirs, articles, and essays about their family heritage. They didn't all agree with each other. Some defended FDR's political decisions. Some criticized the family's internal conflicts. Some simply wanted to record the truth. Together, these writer-grandchildren became the keepers of the Roosevelt flame. Without them, many intimate stories, the private dinners, the disagreements, the laughter, and the small family traditions, would have been lost forever. Their contributions may not have carried the political impact of FDR's policies, but they ensured something equally important, that the Roosevelt family would not be reduced to statues and textbooks. Through their words, they preserved the beating heart of a dynasty. Not every Roosevelt grandchild lived a life of ease or privilege. Some faced hardship, heartbreak, and personal struggles that rarely made the news. A few battled addiction, echoing the difficulties faced by some of FDR's own children. The pressure of living up to a historic name, combined with family expectations, created emotional storms that some found hard to navigate. Their challenges were deeply human, not political scandals, but private battles fought quietly behind closed doors. Some grandchildren faced financial troubles. People assume all presidential families are wealthy, but the Roosevelts were complicated. Much of the original fortune was tied up in property, not cash. Several grandchildren worked regular jobs to support themselves. Some went through bankruptcies, divorces, or periods of instability that the public never saw. A few experienced tragedy early in life, losing parents, facing broken homes, or dealing with the lingering emotional weight of family issues. Growing up famous didn't shield them from pain, it sometimes made it worse. Others struggled with identity. Being a Roosevelt came with expectations, leadership, intelligence, public service. But what if someone wasn't naturally outspoken? What if they wanted an artistic life instead of a political one? These internal conflicts shaped many of their adult paths. These stories rarely appear in history books, but they matter. They show that the Roosevelt family was not a perfect legacy, but a human one, filled with strengths and flaws, triumphs and heartbreaks. The grandchildren who faced hardship remind us that even the descendants of a great leader are still fragile, still vulnerable, and still searching for their place in the world. Some Roosevelt grandchildren carved out surprising careers far from politics, proving that legacy can take many forms. One became a pioneering figure in environmental advocacy, working on conservation long before climate change became a global issue. Another helped build international humanitarian programs, inspired by Eleanor Roosevelt's work with human rights. One grandchild joined the corporate world and became a respected leader in finance and technology. A few found creative paths, becoming musicians, artists, or designers. Their work didn't rely on the Roosevelt name. It relied on talent and persistence. One grandchild became known for documentary filmmaking, using storytelling to explore social issues quietly without headlines. Then there were the athletes. Yes, a few Roosevelt descendants excelled in sports, embracing a competitive spirit that ran through the family. They didn't chase political power. They chased personal goals, driven by passion rather than expectation. These grandchildren proved something important. Legacy doesn't have to mean imitation. It can mean evolution. They took the courage, resilience, and curiosity inherited from their grandparents and applied it to new fields the Roosevelts had never touched. Their contributions may not appear in political biographies, but they exist in communities, classrooms, companies, and causes around the world. These are the Roosevelt grandchildren who shaped their own stories, quietly, confidently, and authentically. America once cared deeply about presidential families, but time has a way of dimming the spotlight. For the Roosevelt grandchildren, fame didn't vanish suddenly. It dissolved gradually. First came the generational distance. FDR died in 1945. By the time his grandchildren reached adulthood, America had new leaders to follow: Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy. Each new president pushed the Roosevelt story a little further into the background. Then came the shift in media. Reporters were less focused on political dynasties and more on Hollywood stars and athletes. The fascination with first families faded unless they were involved in scandal or politics, something most Roosevelt grandchildren avoided. Another factor was the sheer size of the family. With 23 grandchildren and even more great-grandchildren, the Roosevelt lineage became too large for the public to trace. Unlike the Kennedys, who kept a tight political identity, the Roosevelts scattered into different fields and different lives. The grandchildren themselves also contributed to their fading visibility. Many preferred privacy, refusing interviews or declining to write memoir. Some moved abroad. Some changed their last names. Some simply lived quietly. By the 1980s and 1990s, only a handful of the grandchildren were still involved in public life. The rest blended into everyday America. But fading from public memory didn't mean fading in importance. Their stories, though less known, reveal how great legacies evolve, soften, and eventually return to normal life. The Roosevelt grandchildren remind us that even the descendants of giants slip back into the ordinary world. Even if the Roosevelt grandchildren didn't replicate FDR's political power, they carried his influence in subtler ways. Many embraced public service, not through national office, but through local work, school boards, community programs, charities, universities. They lived out the Roosevelt belief that helping others matters, even if no one is watching. Others inherited Eleanor Roosevelt's passion for justice. Some worked in human rights advocacy, others volunteered with refugees, children's programs, and social welfare organizations. Her spirit, compassionate, determined, global, continued through them. And then there was the intellectual legacy. Several grandchildren became professors, economists, researchers, or policy advisors. They carried forward the Roosevelt tradition of curiosity, debate, and education. Even the quietest grandchildren kept the family influence alive simply by passing down values, resilience, courage, and service. They taught their own children not to chase fame, but to chase purpose. In this way, the Roosevelt impact didn't disappear. It changed shape. It moved from the Oval Office to classrooms, neighborhoods, charities, and homes. The legacy shifted from public to personal, from headlines to heartlines. Their grandparents changed the nation. The grandchildren, in their own small but meaningful ways, helped keep that spirit alive. Today, the Roosevelt legacy lives on not through the 23 grandchildren, most of whom are elderly or have passed away, but through the great-grandchildren and great-great-grandchildren. They are educators, activists, engineers, doctors, nonprofit founders, environmentalists, and storytellers. Some still bear the Roosevelt name. Others don't. Some embrace the history. Others rarely mention it. One great-grandchild works in climate advocacy, carrying forward FDR's conservation values. Another is involved in humanitarian outreach, echoing Eleanor's global vision. A few serve on boards that preserve the Roosevelt homes, museums, and archives. The younger generations grew up with a different relationship to fame. For them, FDR is not a memory, but a chapter in a textbook. They don't feel the intense pressure their parents and grandparents felt. Instead, they feel curiosity, an interest in understanding their place in a historic family without being trapped by it. They participate in family reunions, historical events, and museum anniversaries. Some give interviews or attend commemorations, but many live quietly, raising families and building careers like anyone else. The torch has not gone out. It has simply changed hands. The Roosevelt story isn't ending. It's evolving, carried by descendants who honor the legacy while writing new chapters of their own. In the end, the question, whatever happened to FDR's 23 grandchildren, reveals a deeper truth. History remembers leaders, but it often forgets the families who live in their shadows. The Roosevelt grandchildren didn't become presidents or global icons. They didn't reshape the world with sweeping policies. Most of them didn't want to. Their lives were quieter, more human, more scattered, and that is exactly what makes their story powerful. Some carried the legacy through politics, others through teaching, writing, activism, or simple kindness. Some struggled, some succeeded, some disappeared into the ordinary rhythm of American life, but all of them lived with a last name that once belonged to the most powerful man in the world, and they found their own way to carry it. Their story reminds us that legacies are not defined only by fame. They live in values, in choices, in small acts of service. They live in families that continue long after the cameras turn away. Today, the Roosevelt legacy is not a spotlight. It is a quiet flame. And through the grandchildren and the generations after them, that flame continues to burn.